Great, thank you very much for the other Ultra. So I'm Robert Wright. I'm representing the Boston Ultra X project with Paige Warren, PI from UMass Amherst, with Craig Nicholson here in the audience, also from UMass Colin Polsky of Clark, Eric Strauss of the Urban Ecology Institute at Loyola Marymount University. I'm going to talk both about the overall project as well as one specific sub-study, which is the one on looking at the influence of land use policy on forest cover within the metropolitan area. And some of the key issues we wanted to look at with our study, first of all, was urban greening. We've heard a lot about landscape transformations in natural areas like the forest around Harvard Forest, but in fact in the urban condition, what we're looking at is those smaller projects where people are taking vacant lots and planting trees. So we look at Mayor Menino's goal to plant 100,000 new trees. Where should those trees go, and how are people now engaging in Boston and the metropolitan area and changing their landscape? So we'll look at those variety of practices, both from the urban to rural gradient. Some of those are stewardship projects in the more suburban areas, which are outside the 95 area, as well as more urban projects. But how do these small projects lead up to a landscape scale impact on the urban ecosystem is what the project is about. We're also looking at urban growth, land use cover, and land use change across the rural-urban gradient. In particular, we're looking at these two forces of suburbanization as sprawl moves out from Boston towards Harvard Forest, as well as densification. Infill occurs in urban Boston, where we have higher densities happening as well on already developed land. So how do those two forces interact across the rural-urban gradient? So our study area, instead of taking the MSA area, we took the MAPC towns, which are highlighted in the lavender, which the Regional Planning Agency for Boston is called the MAPC. So we looked at the political jurisdiction, or at least the advisory unit that affects this area. We looked at the city of Boston. We want to show you how that overlaps with the LTR project. So this encompasses part of the Plum Island LTR. You can see the Harvard Forest out here. And the city of Boston, which is a major player in our project, in particular for being urban. So we're looking at how have different processes led to the regional land use transformations we're seeing now, to go back historically and look at those, to look at the current ecosystem patterns that we see on the land. Then we'd like to look at what are the social drivers and biophysical processes that led to both social changes, ecological, and health outcomes for the people and the biome of the region. And finally, we want to look at the future of the Boston metropolitan area, looking under different landscape change scenarios, in particular looking at with policymakers and stakeholders in the region to look at the real trajectories of where the region is moving in the future. So this complicated diagram produced by Paige and others is here to help you explain some of the processes we're looking at. So when we're looking at socioeconomic drivers, we're most interested in things like social capital. How does the capital that people invest in the area make a change as far as urban greening goes? Institutional investment and disinvestment. So cities are investing in trees, they're investing in staff and conservation staff in urban forests, or they're not. We see how wealth and population in the urban environment have a lot to do with forest cover. As we know, how land use policy affects both urban greening as well as land use change. And so how all these processes then affect the ecosystem state and structure. Looking at forest cover and composition, there's an emphasis on urban forestry here as well as different sorts of ecosystems. And we look at some of the outcomes that might occur from these. So we look at things like people's attachment to place, stewardship of the landscape, public health outcomes, as was described earlier, that occur depending on the state of that ecosystem. Looking at environmental knowledge as the people are there. If we look at some of bio and geochemical outcomes, we look at biodiversity and invasives and how those interact with the ecosystem services they provide. We'll look at air quality, water quality and quantity, and nitrogen. So the things that you see in red down here are those that we have studies with a range of researchers we'll be looking at. The ones in black are ones we hope to increase in the future. We want to look at climate change as another of those drivers, how they affect each of those systems. And I should acknowledge that there's a whole suite of people working on this project, some who actually may be in this room, because there's a subset of integrated projects, some with the Harvard Forest, some with different researchers around. So I wanted to talk briefly about one of the studies, and then talk about some of the future studies that give you the whole picture of what this project will look at. So in this particular study that Paige led with myself and some research assistants, we looked at forest cover and the impacts of land use policy on forest cover. And we looked across the rural urban gradient, and we picked a series of study towns from Boston moving out to the 495 corridor, as well as taking some across the Springfield metropolitan area to compare those two different metropolitan areas. One that is increasing in population and economic vitality, and one that is frankly struggling. And they each characterize different urban conditions in the United States. You might say post-industrial and maybe post-modern kind of places. So our objectives for this study were to look at the institutional factors that each of the political jurisdictions had in creating this change on the landscape. How does that contribute to forest and open space cover? So we looked at land use, land cover change data for the past 20 years. It was available over MassGIS. We did a policy analysis of the open space plans and other policy documents in each of these towns to see how they impacted, what did they say about what they want to achieve with forest cover and other ecosystem measures. We conducted interviews with the town planners and conservation officials to see what progress had been made over the time period of these plans. And some of the findings, which I'll talk about in detail a little bit, is the open space plans surprisingly focused more on agriculture than forestry, which you might find really surprising considering the rather urban aspect of some of these towns. But as we got into that, we realized that a lot of these towns have limited agricultural resources and in fact lots of forest cover. So people saw agriculture and farms as a limited resource, and the rural character of their town they linked to that agricultural landscape rather than the forest per se. We'll talk about nonprofit involvement a bit and professional staffing. I want to talk a little about population change, just sort of, most of you probably know this one by heart, but population change over that almost 30-year period. Boston actually lost 8% of the population over the time. Other towns in the Boston area, like Boxborough, grew 235%, right? So they over doubled, quadrupled. Others, like Air, lost a bit. So we had some towns which we characterized some as exurban, that were growing rapidly, others that were inner ring suburbs growing very slowly. They also varied with the amount of development that occurred over that period. But if you look at forest change and loss, they all lost forest over that same period. Boston, in fact, which I was very surprised by, this one lost 10% of its forest cover. It lost 8% of its human population. So why did that forest cover decrease in Boston itself? The other thing we looked at, and I won't describe in depth, it's in the article that's in review right now on landscape and urban planning, is that some of the towns like Boxborough you'd expect to lose a lot of forest cover, grew quite a bit, but other ones like Air lost population and still again lost a lot of forest cover. If you look at the tree canopy, there was surprisingly actually more uniformity of range of tree canopy, around 40 to 50% between each of these towns, even though they varied across the rural urban gradient. And Boston, of course, being the least of all those. When we looked at the open space plans, they talked about the lack of focus on forest cover, which we found surprising. And we rated each of these plans for the kind of goals that was stated to give them a cumulative overall specificity to talk about how they address open space and forest protection. So we saw, again, emphasis on agriculture, which we found surprising. Little discussion on urban trees, which was actually kind of sad for us to look at, because a lot of this study was to look at how can we increase the urban tree canopy, as well as street trees were not talked about. There was discussions though about acquisition and activity. So some of the things that people said, because we did interview the planners, were residents prefer the rural character of this place. They see the town as already forested. As well as one of my specific areas was to look at, later in the study, if people's attachment to landscape affects their attitudes towards land preservation, which I did in one of my earlier studies. We did out in Maine, and we did out in Western Mass, was to look at if people have a strong attachment to place, are they more supportive of land stewardship activities and zoning to protect that land? And we actually found a relationship in two of our studies, which we did previously, so we want to look at that as well. So some of the drivers of change that we looked at again were social capital, which we looked at in the form of land trusts. So how active were land trusts in these communities? We looked at institutional investment, where we looked at how much staff do they have, as well as how much acquisition they did to protection. We looked at wealth and population change and general land use policy. So you see all of these towns plotted against the score, which on the x-axis is the land trust score. So the higher the score, the more active the land trusts have been and how they've been there longer in existence in the communities. And if you look at the percentage of town that is protected open space on this particular graph, you'll see there's a trend there where towns that have more active land trusts, Stowe, Lincoln, Weston, have an incredible more percentage of protected land. Towns that have less significant or no activity of land trusts have less protected land. And this, when we did a regression with some of all these other factors, land trust activity was the most significant factor in that regression, rather than just investment in staff or other sorts of activities. So it became an important thing to look at. And one thing we're interested in is when we go into the urban core itself, how do land trusts change when you get farther into the core versus what they do in more rural environments. So for the land trust folks out there, that's very positive information. Some of the interviews we got from people when we talked to the planners was that land trusts, as you know, are more able to make decisions quicker. They're less bogged down in the politics of a respective town. And also that often the goals of the plans that were written in public policy were very much influenced by politics in the town and the individual agenda or interests of the respective natural resource or land use planners. So if a land use planner was interested in urban forests, they would see more forest conservation. If they're interested in other issues, that would decline in popularity. So it wasn't just the monetary investment in planners or natural resource managers, their particular interests having influence on these outcomes. So let me talk about a few of our research plans. When I say research plans, some of these studies have already begun in last year's field season by a suite of folks in the study area. In particular, we're looking at the effects of birds and arthropods on urban greening projects in Metro Boston, and that's Paige Warren and others. We're looking at invasive species. Elkington and Verne are looking at climate change and the density of invasive species. We're looking at environmental knowledge and forest stewardship. We're looking at the effects of participation in urban greening projects. So this is the human side of things, that's my research. Is it changing people's knowledge and action in their particular home landscape? For water quality, we're going to assess how urban greening across the urban land use change and climate change are affecting aquatic ecosystems. Timothy Ranvier, Will Wolheim from UNH. And for public health, we're looking at the relationship between obesity, forest covering open space, that's Russ Lopez, looking at that. And we're looking at air quality and post-greening intervention. Jonathan Levy at Harvard University is looking at when we do increase the tree canopy in particular areas, how does that affect participation in air? So let me show you a few pictures of some of the areas, and some of this work will focus in the city of Boston, others across the metropolitan scale. So we looked at the green space in Boston, and we looked at the tree canopy. In this case, it's by census block, and you can see where there's a lot of tree canopy even in the city of Boston, and where you have a gradient across the city itself in tree canopy. And surprisingly, when you then overlay income level of these areas in canopy, you start to get this mask of areas that have low income, low canopy, which may have effects for public health, low income and high canopy areas, and they all sort of run in this part of Boston. And we have medium income and then high income areas. So we wanted to get a series of paired sites. And these are sites that City Roots, which is a group out of the Urban Ecology Institute, does tree planting projects in and community gardens in. And so those are all the sites there. We took a sample of sites, and I want to show you those. And we did paired bird observations in those sites. Those got urban green, those that didn't. Arthropod sampling. I did behavioral observations of how people use these sites. And we'll go back next field season to compare those as well. So you start to get a paired sample of does urban greening make a difference in people's lives as well as with the ecosystems that are part of those. And finally, all this is going to lead us towards looking at future change in the Boston metropolitan area under different landscape change scenarios. And these landscape change scenarios, we'll start with Craig Nicholson and others in April in the city of Boston, where we've got policymakers from the city of Boston, the region, to meet together to talk about what is the future of the region. These plans here for the Metropolitan Planning Area Commission, these are the future they see for Boston, some of the trends, where they see growth happening, where they see targeted growth happening, and then they look at different trends about what development is occurring now. So we continue to work with neighborhoods in Boston. I did a studio with my landscape architects in the Fairmont Greenway, looking at what our neighborhood's doing right now and how does it affect them. So this really goes from the regional scale of land use change across the gradient down to the site scale, but in a very urban context. So I'd like to open up to any questions at that time.
Yeah, just one quick question, otherwise we can talk to them in the lunch line.
Great, thank you.
With the town planners and the towns that have open space plans, or perhaps they all get this on your site, how much do they focus on invasive species? I grew up in one of those towns, and I'm curious to know what East Long Meadow has to say about invasive. There's so many sites when I go down to visit, my dad and whatnot, or his place, he's in the seas. I look in the little valleys of the little, probably more culvert drainage routes, places where, there are main drags and the little tiny interfaces of greenery, woods out there, they're just so loaded with invasives. And I truly wonder if the people in those towns out there are really aware of invasives.
Yeah, I would say, without sort of going back and looking at the interview data, I would say in general not. I mean, in general, they didn't focus on invasives. A couple of the plans I know do, but as a whole, I wouldn't say that's the main focus of the plan at all. So again, it's a way to try to increase understanding of those by combining the research that's right here with the actual policy.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, it's